All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're taking a hard, impartial look at a seriously terrifying historical pattern: the massive gap between what 20th century leaders claimed in public and the documented reality on the ground. We're going to explore what actually happens when the facts presented to an entire nation completely break away from the truth. To start, listen to this quote from Adolf Hitler's 1940 Reichstag speech. He stood up in front of the whole world and claimed Germany was just locked in a struggle for freedom. He insisted the war was forced upon them. He was explicitly framing his nation, not as the aggressor, but as the total victim of international circumstances. And this brings us to a really fascinating kind of dark puzzle. Think about it. If your country isn't actually under attack, how do you convince everyday average citizens to march off into a global bloodbath? Why would anyone willingly walk into the devastation of war without a clear and present threat? Well, the answer is pretty simple. You have to deliberately manufacture that threat. See, Hitler was constantly claiming his movement just wanted peaceful revisions to the Treaty of Versailles. But when you look at the documented history, it shows a systematic, undeniable timeline of unprovoked aggression. We're talking rearming in 1935, remilitarizing the Rhineland in 36, annexing Austria in 38, and totally seizing Czechoslovakia by 1939. Obviously, these actions completely contradict his whole peaceful approach narrative. So why stage a fake attack? Well, neighboring Poland offered absolutely zero legitimate provocation for war, but Hitler needed one. The German people needed to feel like they were under attack, otherwise they simply wouldn't fight. This desperate need to play the victim led directly to this public justification in September 1939, where Hitler boldly and entirely falsely claimed that Polish soldiers fired first. What we're talking about here is the absolute textbook definition of a false flag attack. It's a hostile act intentionally disguised to pin the blame on somebody else. On August 31st, 1939, in what's known as the Gleiwitz incident, Hitler staged exactly this kind of fake attack, specifically because he absolutely had to have an excuse to sell a pre-planned invasion to his own citizens. And step by step, the historical record lays the whole deception bare. Picture this: German SS forces, literally disguised as Polish troops, stormed a German radio station in Gleiwitz and broadcast a fake invasion message in Polish. It was just a highly orchestrated lie, but it gave Hitler the exact excuse he needed to invade Poland the very next day. So all that public rhetoric about unprecedented self-control, it was a deeply calculated illusion. Behind the scenes, not only was Germany literally faking attacks to kick off the war, but they had actually already signed the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Soviet Union a week earlier to carve up Poland and the rest of Europe. Okay, moving on to Stalin's democratic facade. Because Hitler definitely wasn't the only leader obscuring reality. Let's look at the Soviet Union in 1936. Stalin rolled out what was billed as the single most democratic and progressive constitution on Earth. He publicly guaranteed complete equality, universal elections, freedom of conscience, and freedom of the press. If you were a citizen reading this, it genuinely sounded like an unprecedented era of total liberation. But the horrific reality on the ground completely shattered those promises. Equality? That was actually met with the NKVD's 1937 Polish operation, which deported and executed entire ethnic groups. A guaranteed free press actually meant absolute state censorship under Glavlit, where criticizing the state meant a literal death sentence. And freedom of conscience? Over 40,000 churches were forcibly shut down. To really wrap your head around the absolute severity of this facade, just look at this number: 681,692. That's not a guess. That is the official Soviet archive count of individuals executed during the Great Terror from 1937 to 1938. They were shooting nearly 1,000 people every single day, all while the state threw a party celebrating its so-called total freedom. Now, manipulation of reality doesn't always stem from pure malice. Sometimes it stems from really naive appeasement, which brings us to the illusion of peace under Neville Chamberlain. After negotiating the 1938 Munich Agreement, where he literally handed the Sudetenland over to Germany without a single Czechoslovakian representative even being in the room, Chamberlain went on the BBC. He assured the British public that a larger settlement of lasting peace was officially secured. He painted this beautiful picture of a calm, totally resolved Europe. The problem? Historical data shows this appeasement effectively crippled Czechoslovakia militarily. Chamberlain basically, unwittingly, handed Hitler the exact armament industries and mountain defenses he needed to confidently launch a global war. And just 6 months later, Hitler completed his takeover of Czechoslovakia anyway, proving that this promise of peace was nothing but a complete illusion. The devastating reality of trusting those false promises of peace resulted directly in World War II. It was a conflict that ultimately claimed around 85 million lives. Ignoring documented reality in favor of wishful thinking carries a cost that is almost unfathomable. Finally, let's explore how fabricated domestic data can be just as lethal as military deception. We're looking at the Great Leap Forward in Mao Zedong's China, starting in 1958. In a frantic attempt to industrialize the nation overnight, Mao declared that steel is the key. He demanded that ordinary citizens produce steel in these makeshift backyard furnaces. People were literally melting down their own essential farming tools, cooking pots, even door handles, genuinely believing they were helping rapidly modernize their country. But the reality was a disaster. The metal they produced was this useless, brittle slag. Now, the terrified local officials absolutely knew this, but telling Mao no wasn't exactly an option. So they simply faked their production numbers. They turned a massive, devastating agricultural and industrial collapse into a total fabricated national success story on paper. The domino effect here was dire. Because the central government actually believed these faked agricultural reports, they went in and seized what little actual grain was left. The farming tools were already destroyed, remember? And anyone who dared to stand up and speak the truth, like Defense Minister Peng Dehuai, was instantly purged and silent. The catastrophic result of prioritizing fabricated data and political slogans over human reality? An entirely preventable famine. The truth was totally obscured, and an estimated 30 to 45 million people ended up starving to death. Bringing it all together. The cost of obscured reality. Let's look at the thread that connects all these distinct events. Whether it's utilizing staged border attacks to invent a probable cause for war, throwing up democratic facades to hide mass purges, using naive propaganda to ignore military aggression, or just faking economic metrics to keep a leader happy, the pattern is incredibly clear. Catastrophic loss of life always begins with the manipulation of truth. And honestly, this historical alignment leaves us with a pretty vital question to chew on as we navigate our own era. If history so clearly shows that manipulated facts and unquestioned claims are basically the prerequisites for global catastrophes, are we actively demanding the documented truth today? Or are we just accepting the stories our leaders hand to us? It's definitely something we all need to think critically about.